Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, IRF and Dr. Farouk, for inviting me. And welcome, Nima, to Malaysia again. The first and last time I met Nima was at the launch of Musawa, the global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family that Sisters in Islam initiated and launched in Kuala Lumpur in 2009. So I'm very happy to see her again. I'm trying to organize my thoughts here and what I should speak about. I think a bit on the politics, political Islam, a bit on the impact of the Arab Spring on women's rights. Maybe a little bit more positive than Nitma, because I can't survive if I'm not positive. I have to find hope amidst the stones and rocks and slings of arrows. I was a journalist at the time of the Iranian Revolution. That was 1979. In fact, I was covering PAS. I was covering PAS and UMNO. So I was attending the PAS General Assembly and covering the PAS General. This is the Islamic Party in Malaysia, when Khomeini was a hero. So Shiism was very much welcomed by PAS, okay? Unlike now, you see how politics have changed, right? And Khomeini's pictures were all over the halls of PAS and PAS headquarters and PAS meeting room and all that. And there was somebody from Iran as well who was there. There was somebody from the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt who was there, at PAS General Assembly. So the revolution of 79 and the revolution or Arab Spring or Arab Winter, whatever you want to call, occurred and unfolded in very different contexts in world politics, in the politics of the Muslim world, and the politics of Malaysia in particular. And really, it led to the radicalization of PAS. I'm not saying it's just the Iranian Revolution. It was a whole other thing, the whole Islamic revivalism in the Arab world, post 1973 crisis, the war and all that. It gave confidence. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 gave confidence to PAS, to the Islamist ideologues, that it's possible to establish an Islamic State, it's possible to establish leadership of the ulama. And that was really when PAS changed and got rid of its nationalist leadership, and the likes of Ustaz Hadi and all that came up, and all these graduates of Medina University, Al-Azhar University moved up, and that was the period where political Islam in Malaysia was at its most radical, where PAS declared the UMNO-led government as a government of infidels, the constitution as an infidel, everything was infidel, and demanded a new constitution based on the Quran and the Sunnah. And that really led to the kafir-mengkafir issue. I was a journalist then, and I traveled all over Terengganu, Kelantan, Kedah, I went deep into the villages and really saw that the worst impact of radical Islam on society, on the Malay community, and the divide among the Muslims. I remember going to the kampungs in Terengganu, where you pray in behind separate imams, like Friday prayers, first led by the UMNO, the government appointed imam, whom PAS considered as an infidel imam. So your Friday prayers will not be accepted by God. So the UMNO supporters will pray first, and then the imam finishes his Friday prayers, and the PAS imam goes up and lead the Friday prayers for the PAS supporters. Or they have separate mosques, so the government mosque is seen as an infidel mosque, so the UMNO and government people will pray in the government mosque, and they will reopen an old surau that's been abandoned, and the PAS people would pray there. There were even separate burial grounds, because they will not, bury PAS supporters in burial grounds where UMNO supporters were buried, because the UMNO people are infidel. So this is a kafir burial ground. So segregation between men and women, very loud. And the whole issue of aura, PAS took a position that the woman's voice is aura, and therefore women cannot stand for elections because you cannot speak. Kelantan also stopped sending women karya to the Quran. Every year we have this Quran reading competition because the woman's voice is aura, and that was where the banning of women performing in the makyong and the wayang kulit and all that, the whole, because traditionally Malay women just dress like that, and in traditional dances as well. So all that either banned or women had to cover up. So that was really led to the Iranian Revolution, really led to the radicalization of Islam and political Islam, in Malaysia. And of course the whole issue of hijab too, the wearing of hijab. I was doing my master's at that time in 1985-86, and I interviewed the university students, University Malaya, University Kebangsaan, again at the height of political Islam, segregation between men and women, and segregation between girls who cover up and girls who don't cover up, and the different forms of piety. So the past supporters among the students would be the girls who wear what they call the round mini telekung that covers your chest and covers your waist. So that's the highest grade of piety in university. And the second would be the triangular tudung that covers the chest. That's second grade Muslims. Third grade, of course, just the girls who cover up because of pressure, so cover your hair, just cover your hair, but your neck is showing, your chest is showing, and of course the girls who don't cover up are beyond the pale. Hellfire awaits you, for every, and that was how they were proselytizing in the university. For every strand of hair that is shown, I don't know, some of you are students here, whether that's still being preached, for every strand of hair that is shown, you're gonna forever fall into hellfire. You know how as Muslims we believe that after a certain stage of being in hell, you can still go to heaven. Well, the infidels will never see heaven. But we can still go, after we've been punished enough, we can still go to heaven. But a woman who shows her hair, so you have thousands of strands of hair being shown on a daily basis, and you're just gonna be forever be burning in hellfire. So the students were telling me how this image is just in their minds, and how it just scared them, and the anonymous notes being placed under their doors for leaving their head uncovered, for having friends who are Chinese or Indians, for mixing with the kafirs. So this was really, and I remember I interviewed the president of the Islamic Student Society at University Malaya. He refused. I mean, first of all, I had to chase him to get him to agree to an interview. And he finally agreed to see me, but balik tabir, behind a curtain. Because as a man, he cannot sit together with me in a room. The door has to be kept open. Not only the door has to be kept open, there was a curtain, and he sat on one side of the curtain, and I sat on the other side of the curtain conducting this interview with him, I hope those days are over. I haven't gone back to the universities, and maybe after this, you guys can tell me what's going on in the universities. I must have interviewed about 40 over students, and just trying to figure out what was happening in the universities, why this radicalization and this segregation that's never been the history of, in Malay culture and Malay practice of Islam. We've never had a culture of segregation between men and women. There's never such a thing as the men's space and the women's space. People always mix together. So that was the context in which the Iranian Revolution was unfolding, and the impact of the Iranian Revolution. Of course, in Malaysia, you had, started the Islamization policy and all that, and this is where we're at today. But I think the Arab Spring, unfolded in a very different context, and in terms of the positive, and the difference I would say is that the fact that it's led by young people. It's young people who demanded the overthrow of authoritarian leaders. And these young people did not ask for an Islamic State, did not ask for Sharia law, did not ask for hudud law. The young people wanted freedom, wanted justice, wanted jobs, social justice, socio-economic justice, bread, freedom, dignity. That's the slogan on the streets. Irhal, go, leave, you old dictators, leave, and you didn't see Islamic symbols in the streets. You don't see La ilaha illallah, you don't see the sword, you don't see the green flags flying in the streets of Cairo or Morocco or Tunisia, And so really, secondly also, I think it is different from that context of the Iranian Revolution, because the Arab Spring also unfolded at a time when the dominant ethical paradigm of the modern world is one on democracy, human rights, and women's rights. You know, so this is the dominant paradigm of the modern world today, including the Muslim world. Yeah, and so what is happening now is you see what is a public contestation taking place in the Arab world and in the Muslim world between conservative, ideological Islamist actors demanding Islamic State, demanding a very conservative, misogynistic Sharia, demanding the hudud law, and more progressive, secular, and not necessarily, not everyone who's progressive is secular, but Muslim Democrats who basically forget about the Islamic State, forget about the hudud law. What we want is a democratic civil state. And I think this is the most important development and public contestation that is taking place. And it's something that we really need to build on. And I think what's happening compare what's happened in Tunisia and Egypt too is very significant. Why is it in Tunisia, the Islamist party in Tunisia, Ennahda, led by Rashid Ghannouchi, were able to overcome the ideological divide between the Islamists and the progressives and reach consensus, yeah? And why is it that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt were not able to do that, and in the end led to its overthrow by the military, but with popular support on the ground. And I think this development is also significant because we should be asking ourselves here in Malaysia, in this, some Malaysians are still very enamored by the idea of hudud law and Islamic State. Why is it that in countries like Tunisia and Egypt, which is like, what, 95% Muslim, 98% Muslim, they've rejected the Muslim Brotherhood, and its promise of an Islamic State. And Tunisia, even more radical, the groups that demanded there should not be any reference to Sharia in the constitution won. Their voice won the day. And how come Rashid Ghannouchi agreed that there will not be any reference to Sharia law in the constitution of Tunisia, So Rashid Ghannouchi, a major ideologue of the Islamist movement, really talking very, very publicly about equality, about non-discrimination, about not rolling back on the very good personal status law in Tunisia, all these promises that he made. And this is really, I think it's really, many, many reasons, but the context of the times, where you've got a strong women's movement, in Tunisia, a very secular tradition in Tunisia. And I think Rashid Ghannouchi as well, who spent 30 years in exile living in England, as opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood leaders, many of whom were, were not exposed to the outside world. And I think another important significance in terms of difference between the Iranian Revolution and the Arab Spring today is really, it is happening in the context of the failure of the Iranian Revolution, of the Islamic State, of the Islamic Revolution to deliver on the aspirations of the people. 30 years of rule by the mullahs, it has not delivered social justice, it has not delivered equity, it has not delivered equality, and the failure of the Islamic State, the theocratic leadership, to deliver on the aspirations of the Iranian people is seen as the failure of Islam. When you rule in the name of Islam and you fail to deliver, the people see that as the failure of Islam to deliver. So is Islam a source of solution? The slogan Islam, is the solution on the back of cars that you see in Malaysia, because that was the slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood, of the Islamist groups, and I've been to Iran a few times, and been talking with people there, and like one of the professors who had supported the revolution, said that, we thought Islam was like a hypermarket. For every problem, Islam has an answer. You just press the button and poof, the answer will come from Islam. But trying to run a government and run a society, manage a society based on Islam is not managing a hypermarket. And they found out very difficult ways that, the solution does not lie with just Islam alone. You have to search for solution you know, from many, many sources of secular knowledge and secular laws and secular practices. Yeah? And, and if at all, you know, the Arab Spring demonstrators were looking for a model of a Muslim state, you know, if at all there was a model, they were actually looking at Turkey and the AKP, Erdogan's party, which has its Islamist roots, but given again the strength of the secular tradition of Turkey, you know, while it might have tried to, you know, bring about changes, it cannot break that secular foundations of the Turkish constitution and the Turkish, you know, society, elite society that dominates Turkish politics and Turkish economy. So, you know, the Arab Spring really has not brought about that sloganeering that you saw post-Iranian Revolution of like Islam is the solution, yeah? And I think this is important because the demand for democracy, for an end to authoritarianism under whatever guise, Islam or secularism, is clear. You know, while it remains contested, it still remains contested, but there is a voice out there now that is open, that is in the streets of the Muslim world, in the Arab world, that's demanding for democracy, for human rights, for women's rights, and you can't, and this is a social force, you know, it might not be the dominant social force, but it is a force that is now legitimate and out there in the streets, yeah, and it's a fearless voice as well. You know, I think one very important consequence of the Arab Spring is the absence of fear anymore. I don't care. You're a general, you're the president, you're the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, you're the Mufti of Egypt. I am not scared of you anymore. And people will go out into the streets to have their voice heard. And of course, my friends, my feminists, you know, the Arab feminists I've been working with for decades, you know, have been very depressed, you know, by the Arab Spring because, you know, it had led, you know, to the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists winning power in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Morocco, and the fear of what that meant. And of course, the most conservative voices emerged. You know, like, first thing, reintroduce polygamy, allow polygamy. Bring down the age of marriage for women to 9 because the Prophet married Aisha at the age of 9. You know, and this is Islam. This is the best Islam can offer, you know. So these voices then, of course, emerge in parliament, you know, and demanding, you know, rolling back the advances women had made over the decades in these Arab countries to roll back, you know, the Islamic family law to make it authentically Islam. Because all these rights women had gained over the past 30 years, 20, 30 years, are considered un-Islamic, yeah? So, same age of marriage, 18 is the age of marriage, un-Islamic because the Prophet married Aisha at the age of 9. Women's right to divorce, un-Islamic because women don't have rights. You know, and of course, you know, the streets, you know, became unsafe for women. So the whole issue of sexual harassment, not that it just began after the Arab Spring, you know, there was all this sexual harassment. But I think after seeing the women out there in the streets, and women really making their voices heard, and after the overthrow of the dictators, when women came out into the streets, the conservative men wanted women back into their homes. And there was that very famous picture of one of the leaders of the women's movement in Tunisia. You know, there was, you know, a bearded man just like that, shutting her, they were like out in the streets demonstrating, and this man just covered her face and her mouth with his hand, just such a symbol, a strong symbol of like, you shut up, you don't have a voice, you don't have a place out in the public space, you know. So of course, because of all these things that were happening, you know, many of the feminists in the Arab world, who are most of them very secular feminists. So that's another difference between the Arab world and Southeast Asia, where you have groups like Sisters in Islam, you know, and the groups in Indonesia, feminist women's rights group, who work with religion. The Arab feminists don't work with religion. Yeah, I mean, they see religion as inherently unjust, patriarchal, forget about Islam. You know, we work on human rights principles in order to advance women's rights. Yeah, so there's a big debate. So don't think that, you know, sisters in Islam, the work of sisters in Islam or Musawa have the support of the Muslim feminists. Yeah, they're very critical of us working with religion. Yeah, because they feel that we give legitimacy to religion in the public space where religion should be out, you know, should be behind closed doors and not be a source of law and public policy. But I was in all these meetings, you know, I kept telling them that the space for debate has opened up. Every voice can be heard. The most conservative extremist voice is being heard. Your voice should be heard as well. So how do you challenge those guys who are saying the age of marriage should come down to 9? You should be challenging them, you know, and you should use more than human rights principles. You know, use the arguments. Here's your opportunity to open up the space for debate on Islamic matters. Why do you allow these misogynistic, you know, medieval men to dominate the public space and to define what Islam is, Islam is not? You now, as citizens wanting a democratic country, wanting a just country, wanting a new constitution, a new government, should engage in that public space for debate on women's rights and women's rights in Islam as well. And that this is really the best opportunity to break the monopoly of the Islamists, of the ulama, of the patriarchs in government, and define, shape the definition of what Islam means in our lives today and what role Islam should play as a source of law and public policy. And you know what, the Iranian Revolution, and so again the Arab Spring is unfolding within a different context. You know, the growth of what scholars call, I don't call it, but scholars who write about it call Islamic feminism. Women's rights groups that are working with religion, engaging with the religion, reinterpreting the religion, you know, from a rights perspective, and using the religion as a source of empowerment, not just human rights principles, but Islam as a source of empowerment. And this really grew as a result of the Iranian Revolution. What the Iranian Revolution did in the government, you know, bringing down the age of marriage to 9 and all that, is, you know, they dusted out all the classical fiqh texts from the cupboards and used classical fiqh, you know, as a source of law and public policy. And of course, there's such an incredible disconnect between classical fiqh that developed in the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century within the context of 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century, and how it can be used in the 21st century, the 20th century and 21st. So there's a huge disconnect between law and reality. For example, you know, in Iran, like if, you know, all these men died in the battle, in the war with Iraq. And the women, they lost their husbands. They also lost custody of their children because custody went to the father's side. And so the women organized and protested and, you know, and said, no, we want our right to custody of the children, and this is within Islam, and did their research and come out to argue for their rights in Islam. And so Ziba Mir Hosseini, an Iranian scholar, you know, said that Islamic feminism is actually the unwanted child of political Islam. It was political Islam, the use of Islam as an ideology, as a political ideology to win power, to gain power, gave birth to feminism in Islam, to Islamic feminism, you know, because, so what's happening is that the women are using the master's tool to challenge the master, that the masters no longer have monopoly and hegemony over this tool, this Islam used as a tool, yeah, to control us and to control our lives. And I also see change too, you know, the older feminists, secular feminists in the Arab world, and this is also the same in South Asia, in Bangladesh, Pakistan, India. Muslim feminists there are very, very secular and don't want to engage with religion. But younger feminists, there's a difference now, yeah, where the young feminists, they are the ones who are willing to want to engage with religion, want to understand Islam from a rights perspective, because the Islam that they've been educated with and brought up with is the patriarchal Islam. And on the basis of that patriarchal, misogynistic Islam that they grew up with, they rejected Islam. Yeah, the old feminists rejected Islam on the basis of what the man said Islam is. But now that they've been exposed to new ideas and new possibilities for equality, for justice, for change that has come out from the growth of the Islamic feminist movement, many young feminists and young women in the Arab world and in South Asia said, look, we want to understand this better. This is an Islam that we didn't get in our schools, we don't get on radio and television, but it is a very empowering Islam. That we don't have to choose between, and for me that's, the most wonderful thing to hear, coming from young women who learn more about the work of Sisters in Islam and Musawa, to say finally we don't have to choose between being a good Muslim and being a feminist, that I can reconcile my faith with my feminism. And for many young people this is extremely important. Why are we always being put in a place where we need to choose between one and the other, as if all the good is in one box and all evil is in one box, whether it's Islam or secularism? And really this is the reality now that cannot escape the Arab world, the Arab man, the Muslim man, that women, look at all of you, young women who are, in universities, educated, and that you are as smart, if not smarter, than many men, so why continue this belief, inherent belief, that women are inferior to men? The reality does not bear that ideology out. The reality is there are some men who are better than some women, and there are some women who are better than some men. That's nature. But this belief that all men are superior to all women, all men must be leaders, all men must have authority over all women, like in Saudi Arabia, never mind, it's a 1-week-old baby son, he can give authority for his mother to go to the United States to get heart, surgery. It is ridiculous. There was one case where I heard where this 8-year-old mentally disabled child was the muhrim for the mother to go for medical treatment in the West, so so what I'm saying is that the uncertainty brought up by the Arab Spring, it's that it has forced all these spaces for dialogue to open, and I think it behooves the women's rights movement in the Arab world to take advantage of this opening up of the spaces, to make their demands heard, to make their voices heard, and to really once and for all break the hegemony and the monopoly of the Islamists, of the patriarchs, of the Al-Azhar scholars in defining what Islam is and what it is not. So you see, and for me, that's, the fact that the Islamists, another important development too, is the evolution of the Islamist movement in the Arab world, in Malaysia, where you see, leaders of Islamist movement, people like Rashid Ghanouchi, pledging that Tunisia will be a plural, secular society with respect for human rights, for women's rights, so for someone like Rashid Ghanouchi, who is a major political ideologue of the Islamist movement, to publicly make that commitment, for me, is extremely important. So even though my feminist friends in Tunisia don't believe him and say, oh, it's just rhetoric, but the fact that he is saying it in public means you can hold him accountable to his words, And in Egypt too, you see the break of the Muslim Brotherhood. Even the Salafi party, what is it called, Anur, even they have broken up. So all these Islamist parties, once they engage in the political process, the reality of wanting to win power and the reality of governing actually force its own natural contestation. So you have Muslim Brotherhood leaders like Abdul Al-Fatuh, who broke away from the Muslim Brotherhood and formed his own party, and calling, doesn't he say, no Islamic State, calling for a civil democratic state. So what you're saying now, I think, and this I think is a very important development for us to monitor and to support, the growth of, what they call Muslim Democrats. Yeah, they are Democrats looking at the sources of Islam for democratic practices, for women's rights, for human rights. And the reality of governing and the reality of wanting to contest in the political system and wanting to win power, and the reality of the context of today where democracy, human rights, women's rights, are important ethical principles of a modern nation state, force this now very public contestations that taking place not just within, in the society at large, within Islamic parties and within Islamist movements. So I think that is an extremely important development. And you see this contestation, the result of the contestation coming up in the constitutions of, the new constitutions of Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco. You look at so the trend towards recognizing equality and non-discrimination is very clear. In the Tunisian constitution, electoral rules, the list of people standing for election, men, women, men, women, men, women, men, women, which means, it will lead eventually to, equal numbers of men and women in parliament. And the constitution also encumbers the state to take steps to make sure that this happens in the state assemblies as well. So clear recognition of equality and non-discrimination and parity for women, equality for women and men in the Tunisian constitution. In the Egypt constitution, the one not by the Muslim Brotherhood, that got thrown out, and then the new constitution after the military took over. It's really, the women's groups have welcomed some of the provisions in the Egyptian constitution, where for the first time the state is committed to women holding public and senior management positions without discrimination, and the state is committed to protect women from all forms of violence. So this is like for the first time in the Egyptian constitution. In Morocco, of course, Morocco has gone way ahead. There's an Islamist party now in power that's won elections in Morocco, but with all the changes that's happening there, the amended constitution has probably gone the furthest in the Arab world in framing equality within human rights, within a comprehensive definition of human rights. That means equality, political, social, civil, and cultural rights. There must be equality between men and women in the Moroccan constitution, an explicit prohibition of discrimination and gender discrimination. So of course, in the end, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, It's wonderful to have all these wonderful laws and rights in the constitution, but how do you implement it? How do you change attitudes and values, to bring reality to these constitutional ideals? But for me, it's still very important that the law and the constitution sets the standards to which we as a society must aspire to and work towards. So it's really a long and difficult journey. And Saudi Arabia is probably like, oh my God, the longest journey to take. But the fact that women are organizing and making demands and getting their voices heard, and again, are not scared, I think it's an important progress. There are many Islamists today, whether in the Arab world or in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, who are now fashioning themselves as Muslim Democrats and as really eschewing this fixation with the Islamic State and the Hudud law. People like Dr. Zulkifli and Khalid Samad in PAS, they kind of like, I don't know whether they label themselves or others label them as the Erdogan faction within PAS, although now Erdogan is a bit out of fashion with what's happening in Turkey. And I really think we shouldn't be trapped. With all this, right now with the demands for the Hudud law, we are all, I feel that we as citizens are being toyed, played around by our political masters and our political elite, and forcing us to choose, do you want, Islam or do you want secularism? Do you want hudud law or do you want civil law? Do you want tradition or do you want modernity? Why? Why are these choices offered before us? These are false choices. These are false dichotomies. These are dichotomies that are deliberately politically manufactured in order to divide us. Really, the choice before us is between democracy and despotism and authoritarianism, between good governance and corruption, between equality and discrimination, between social justice and inequity. Who doesn't want democracy? Who doesn't want equality? Who doesn't want social justice? Do you want inequity, injustice, despotism? You know, that is the choice before us, not between Islam and secularism, civil law and hudud law. Those are politically constructed false binaries meant to divide us. You know, so we should all really be clear-minded, you know, that you know, authoritarianism, despotism, corruption, inequity, injustice, discrimination against women happen in secular governments and in Islamic governments. They happen on all sides, you know, so let's be clear about the choices that we want. Yeah, it is equality, it is justice, it's democracy, it's human rights, it's women's rights that we want, not Islam versus secularism, hudud law versus civil law. So let's really focus on building a society where these are the choices we want to make, and these are the values that we want to work towards for the future of Malaysia. Yeah, not this constructed manufacturing of hate and division to serve the political, short-term political ends of some people who want to maintain power or want to get into power. So let's be clear-minded about what we want as a future and not be trapped into the political gamesmanship of the political elite in this country. Thank you.
Thank you.